As the supply of houses for sale dwindles and prices skyrocket, one group is getting hit particularly hard: renters. Rental rates increased 1.3% last year, the fastest increase in a decade. These renters face the risk of eviction once the federal moratorium lifts on June 30th. That's coming up.
Democratic strategist and senior VP at Firehouse Strategies, Michael Starr Hopkins, and senior news producer at the Daily Signal and visiting fellow at the Independent Women's Forum, Kelsey Bolar, join us now to discuss. Michael, I have a sense that the eviction moratorium is going to be scapegoated in this debate, that you're going to start to see people who are complaining about the high price of rent and complaining about their inability to purchase a house, all of them very legitimate complaints. And you're going to have politicians who are going to try to channel that anger at the eviction moratorium and say, well, it's actually these freeloaders that are the ones to blame. I don't think that's true, but we've seen this kind of scapegoating before. What's your take?
I mean, I think that's exactly what's going to happen. Rather than, address the actual issue, which is an inflated housing market and a lack of ability for younger people to be able to buy property, they're going to blame freeloaders because that's the easiest thing to do, and young people vote at an abysmal rate. But I think the real issue in this country, there is a housing crisis. When you look at housing on the coasts of the country, it is insanely expensive. And a lot of people that live in cities can't afford that housing. They can't afford the rentals. And so they're forced to move farther away from the city, which is a longer commute. And there really is a problem around all this. And then in the middle of the country, you have these corporations coming in and buying massive amounts of housing. And the bubble that we saw in 2008, I really worry that we're on the verge of it happening again for the same reasons, because we didn't learn the history the last time.
Yeah, Kelsey, millennials are still kind of struggling to crawl out of that recession hole, especially when it comes to things like homeownership. That's extremely difficult, especially for so many millions of millennials who live in cities. And it doesn't just stop at millennials. This is really for everybody who's experiencing these prices. Is Washington doing anything to make this better? Can Washington do anything to make this better? Or is Washington's involvement at all just going to make things worse?
I think it's already made things worse. I have to give credit to the Washington Post. About a month ago, did this great in-depth reporting on the situation in our capital in Washington, D.C., where you had landlords who were going without any income because of the inability to evict their tenants. I want to be clear, I have a lot of sympathy for those who are unable to pay their rent right now. This story highlighted a former chef who lost his job during the pandemic. But at this point, there is a massive wealth of jobs. Restaurants are having a difficult time hiring and offering all these extensive benefits to try to lure employees back in. And so there's really not an excuse for Americans not to be working now at this point when we do have vaccines available and jobs available. Certainly they deserved help early on, but at this point, the government policies of banning evictions, especially how extreme they are in Washington, D.C., where you can't evict a tenant for any reason. They could basically be destroying your property, which in this story, it sounded like some tenants were causing major damage and just didn't care much. The landlords had no alternative means, no alternative options for their own income. And so these government policies, instead of just there being one victim, which again was clear early on in the pandemic when so many individuals lost their jobs and couldn't afford rent, we now have two victims, where you now have landlords who I think we like to pretend that they're these, wealthy billionaires or millionaires who can afford to go without their tenants' rent for a year at a time, when in reality, many of them are hardworking small business owners who rely on the income of 1, 2, maybe 3 properties. And when they've gone without that for over a year now and also have to pay for upkeep of these houses, it leaves them in a very difficult situation. And again, these government policies leave 2 victims instead of 1.
Although at the same time, there actually are some landlords out there who are millionaires and billionaires and who can go a year or more without accepting rent. And some of those are the investors that Michael Starr Hopkins talked about earlier. This idea that private equity investors are amassing mass amounts of capital and going around and then competing with other buyers, driving up prices, gobbling up all the housing, and then renting it out to people at even higher rates seems unsustainable for the American way of life. Speaking of what Washington can do, Washington could ban that, or Washington could pass tax policy that disadvantages it. Right now, if you're a private equity buyer, you can make an all-cash offer, and there are even localities where you have a couple percentage point advantage against somebody who's taking out a loan or a mortgage. And so, over time, private equity is going to crush everybody, and will be an entire nation of renters, and the ability of anybody to buy a house and grow wealth that way will have vanished. Michael, what do you think about the idea of Washington just saying, no, as a matter of policy, we don't want private equity investors owning millions of homes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's got to be kind of the natural inclination of how things go. Because if you look at this, what you're going to end up happening is Americans are going to have to take out loans at higher rates and for larger amounts than they initially would have, which, if there is any type of crisis again, will lead to the foreclosure of these houses and the default of that debt, which is basically what happened in 2008. Were this to happen again, it's going to be really hard for the country to be able to pass any kind of legislation which would aid those either, I guess it wouldn't apply to renters, but to purchasers of these homes, because of what we've seen during the pandemic and because of what we saw during the bailout in 2008. And so the government needs to get ahead of this, because if they don't, they're going to end up reacting. And we've all seen how amazing the government is at reacting to crises.
Kelsey, on that point, is there a market reaction that could fix this problem more quickly or more efficiently in your mind?
More houses, the ability to build more houses and more apartment buildings. Fortunately, we know the cost of lumber has skyrocketed. We have rising inflation across the board, which is making it very difficult for builders to build more houses. And unfortunately, the Biden administration's policies of spending taxpayer dollars with no limit, with no hesitation, is going to make this problem worse. We need an economy that enables our supply to meet the demand. And if we have an inflation problem, that's never going to happen. I'm no economist, but this is a basic supply and demand issue.
But that's actually not true, though. It's not a basic supply and demand issue, though, because what you're seeing is private industry come in and artificially inflate the prices. If the market was working by itself and we had honest brokers on both sides, then I would totally agree with that. But what you're seeing is private industry pump money in so that the prices go up, and then they're able to buy those properties and profit off them at higher margins. And so, there's this invisible hand coming in that's basically acting as a third participant.
We have to wrap.
If you had
10 seconds.
If you had enough supply, then these bad actors wouldn't be able to do that.
This has been a really interesting conversation. Thank you both for offering your insights today.
Thank you.
We'll be back with more Rising after this.